Okay, here we go again. Uh, Relativity physics textbooks are all wrong. The title of this talk is based upon a paper by Conrad van Zang. This paper says Einstein's simple mathematical trick and the illusion of a constant speed of light, and it was published in 2013 in an applied physics research journal. What he says is, whether the reader is a student or a teacher or a researcher, this should be of concern. Our textbooks are wrong, all the physics textbooks are wrong. Many of the things that Conrad van Zang says is similar to things said in my previous talk. Light speed is not constant in special relativity. I shall now go through some of the relevant points in his paper. He says the one-way speed of light, contrary to a strict interpretation of Einstein's second postulate, is not constant, and describes the appearance of light speed invariance, i.e. light speed constancy, is a trick or illusion. He tells us the ether exists. So this talk is more emphasizing the existence of the ether. What Conrad says, in the real world, ether exists and serves as the conducting medium of light waves. One should pay no attention to the contrary assertions that appear in high school and college texts, which invariably state there is no such thing as ether. So this is why the physics textbooks are all wrong. He again goes on, the ether is described as just an old discarded concept, strictly 19th century voodoo science, and voodoo science is a term that the mainstream likes to use to dismiss ideas it don't like. One should, however, pay attention to what is written in the research articles of the various physics journals. It is now commonly accepted that the universe is permeated by ether, a generic term for the space medium. While the existence of ether is not at issue, the property of ether are subject to considerable debate. It should also be understood that most professionals are embarrassed to actually use the term ether, with its negative historical connotations. They prefer to use more exotic terms such as quantum foam, cosmic substratum, dynamic free space, background substructure, and other such terms. So it's embarrassing to use the term ether, so you use a different name instead, just moving the goalposts, as I would call it, and playing tricks with words. Cannot really blame them, he says. Imagine having to acknowledge that you've had it all wrong and that your profession had it wrong for almost 100 years. This is embarrassing to say the least. So all the physics textbooks are wrong, saying there's no ether, and the way they try to get around that is to come up with a different name for ether. Conrad tells us the main reason for the extraordinary delay in recognizing the reality of a space medium, which is ether, can probably be attributed to the remarkable illusion of light speed invariance as meaning constancy of light speed. The details of the illusion will be more meaningful with an initial brief discussion of basic motion, i.e. physics based on misunderstandings coming from special relativity. So Conrad wants us to consider this setup where you have a light pulse being transmitted from A to a reflector at B and then bouncing back again to A, and the ether wind is being considered as moving to the right. And he says that we now consider a 2-clock experiment like the one shown above in the diagram being conducted in a total vacuum, say on the moon. If you're doing the experiment on the Earth, you've got atmosphere, and if you want to do it in a vacuum. A light pulse is being outward across the moon crater and then reflected back to the starting point at A. With the absence of any sort of atmosphere, the speed of light pulse must be c, the speed of the pulse with respect to the ether. Instead of an atmospheric wind, the experiment invokes an ether wind. So he then goes on to give the mass for this, and this is equation 2.3, which he gives. It follows that the two travel time intervals between clocks A and B will be different, and so you've got the first equation giving the time interval from A to B, and the second equation given the time interval from B to A. And he goes on to then explain, this means that the speed of the light pulse with respect to the moon surface frame is not the same for the two directions. You've got a speed c plus v subscript a is not the same as speed c minus v subscript a. Now, here is what happens when an attempt is made to synchronize the two identical clocks, one at A and the other at B. The operator of clock A sends out a light pulse. When the signal is received by clock B, it is automatically and instantly set to 0 and immediately sends the return signal back to A. Upon receiving the return pulse, clock A is reset to read time t subscript A equal to half times 2A travel time. That is, clock A is instantly reset in accordance with the formula t subscript A equal to half times time interval A to B plus time interval B to A. So those time intervals you add together and then you divide by 2. And with this reset accomplished, clocks A and B are deemed to be synchronized, and if there was no motion with respect to ether, i.e. no ether winds, they would actually be synchronized. But clock A with this synchronized procedure has introduced an error. So he then goes on to say, consider clock B. Clock B has been set to 0 and will read t subscript B at synchronization equal to d divided by c minus v subscript A at the instant of synchronization, the instant at which clock A received the return pulse. Consider clock A. Clock A is set to read t subscript A at synchronization equal to half times all of the that equation at the instant of synchronization. The error introduced is the difference between those two times, which is calculated to be this difference he gives in equation 2.4. The latter is the first approximation of the synchronization error, and he cites the source for that. Next should be shown how Einstein makes the speed of light the same, i.e. constant, for both directions. Then later the details on how nature actually makes it appear that the speed of light is constant. And he explains Einstein used a simple procedure to make the speed of light constant. First, he deems the two travel times to be identical as if by magic. In his own words from Einstein's famous 1905 paper, he has Einstein saying, we established by definition that the time required by light to travel from A to B equals the time it requires the light to travel from B to A. Now, I note that this is the usual translation of Einstein from German into English, and Conrad seems to be unaware that is a mistranslation. So this is correcting the mistranslation of Einstein, and I cite the reference. But it's not possible without further assumption to compare in respect of time an event at A with an event at B. We have so far defined only an A time and a B time. We have not defined a common time for A and B. And in the square brackets is what Einstein is being mistranslated as saying, for the latter cannot be defined at all unless you establish by definition. And that is wrong. A faith translation would be the latter time can now be defined in establishing by definition. So the difference is it's now, can now. The difference between the word now and cannot be defined. It's the mistranslation is saying it cannot be defined, but in the correct translation it's not saying cannot be defined. It's saying we're only taking it now as that definition. In my talks on Einstein being mistranslated, I have explained that historians want science papers to be uncorrected. So Einstein's paper, with all its mistakes in translation, have been reprinted numerous times without correction. Thus, people like Conrad are unaware that they're going by an uncorrected mistranslation of Einstein when they refer to him. Naively, they think they are going by a scientific paper that has had its mistakes corrected, when really they're going by a historical paper where all the mistakes have been kept. Anyway, proceeding by the definition, Conrad explains what Einstein is doing is the following. He's basically declaring this equation 3.1, and now Einstein is defining how the clocks are going to operate by this definition. And under the correct translation of Einstein, you don't have to set the clocks to operate that way. It's optional as to whether you set the clocks that way. It's just that under the incorrect translation, it leads you to believe that the clocks must be set that way. And so not having to set the clocks that way, that means the one-way light speed is variable. And having the one-way light speed as constant is just a peculiar way of setting the clocks to work. And then going by what is Einstein's ad hoc definition as how to set the clocks, Conrad then explains that makes the ether disappear. He simply declares, this is Einstein, that the time interval from A to B is the same as the time interval from B to A, which is the same as declaring equation 3.1. Essentially, this makes V subscript A equal to 0. By solving the equation for V subscript A, one finds that V subscript A equals 0. It is in the application his definition that Einstein disconnects from the real world and makes any speed with respect to ether equal to 0. In effect, he declares ether to be non-existent. So ether is really there. It's just by this trick in the maths Einstein has made the ether disappear. As Conrad goes on to explain it, the remarkable mathematical illusion became enshrined in Einstein's second postulate, making the speed of light invariant for any non-accelerating observer. And of course, doing that trick is optional if you take into account the correct translation of Einstein. Conrad explains that one-way speed of light has been shown by actual experiments to be variant. That is, the propagation speed of the pulse from A to B is not the same as the speed from B to A. This difference can only arise in the presence of a light conducting ether, which is in motion. In the real world, then, actual one-way speed of light is not constant. And I would add, one-way speed of light is not really constant in special relativity, despite some people having misunderstood relativity as meaning that. Conrad concludes, whether the reader is a student or a teacher or a researcher, this should be of concern. Our textbooks are wrong. The glaring actual error in most textbooks is the claim it is impossible to detect our motion relative to the ether. Also an error is the claim that the famous Michelson-Morley experiment has a null result. The truth is, Michelson and Morley did measure an ether wind. It was merely less than had been expected. They had simply failed to take into account the physical length contraction of their apparatus, a phenomenon of which they were not aware at the time. And he refers to his other paper dealing with that. The fact is, light speed invariance is an illusion, i.e. light speed constancy is an illusion. By light speed meaning one-way light speed. The illusion depends on the measuring method. Moreover, the one-way speed of light has been proven to be non-constant. And then he says the one-way speed of light is not what Einstein postulate says it is. And that last bit I would have rather said is Einstein's relativity has been misunderstood, and what has been especially misunderstood is the postulate about light speed. So I conclude no light speed constancy in special relativity. By that meaning, no one-way light speed constancy in special relativity. As per Einstein in his special relativity paper of 1905, he has in section 3, he says, but the ray moves relative to the initial point of k when measured in the stationary system with the velocity c minus v. And I'm not bothering too much about complaining about translation problems on this, just going by what it is, so that you get that equation. And this is before section 5, where Einstein does relativistic velocity addition. So he's not treating c added to minus v as relativistic velocity addition, and thus the velocity c minus v is less than c for when v is greater than 0, i.e. light travels with velocity c minus v, which is not equal to c, so it's not constant in this section 3. There's no light speed constancy in special relativity. If mean by that, light always travels with speed c. Those who think there is have misunderstood it. It's just the way Einstein is synchronizing the clocks that he's imposing a definition on those clocks as to how light is to be treated. But independent of that, and you can be independent of that, light speed is not constant. Thus all physics textbooks are wrong as to what is being taught to physics students. The technical term is physics students are being foobarred, and you need to look at what the word foobarred means if you don't know. Basically, students are lied to, they are being misinformed. Finished, thank you, the end.